What the hell are you doing back? I don't know, but this is the What the Hell podcast. I'm your host, Paul Harrell. For whatever the hell reason you are back, I'm glad to have you. We are starting a new themed series today based around the question, was Jesus God? It's a pretty big question. This is probably going to be a several part series, so we are just going to dive right in. Was Jesus God? For the sake of this discussion and this study, let's try to forget for a moment our personal beliefs, forget what we may think, forget what the church may have taught you, or what the world has taught you about Jesus and God. And Jesus being God, whatever that may be, let's try to let it go for now. I know that can be easier said than done, but let's try to let all of that go. And I'm always talking about forgetting what you know about the Bible, forgetting about your interpretations, and allow the biblical authors to tell you what you need to know, and let the biblical authors interpret the scriptures for you. And that is actually one of the goals and the driving forces for the purpose of this podcast, to allow the biblical authors to determine and define and to tell you what the Bible says. And for us to stop trying to interpret a book that's not meant to be interpreted by anyone else other than the author. The biblical authors have already interpreted it for you. You don't need to make your own interpretations. That's how things get messy and lost, and why there's so many different denominations and traditions, and it's just a mess. So, just the same, in this case, let's forget what we think we know and allow Jesus himself to tell us who he was. Let's let Jesus do that. Not our own minds, not the church, not the world. Let's let Jesus do it. And definitely not me. Definitely not me. Let's let Jesus do the talking. That's what I challenge and ask you to do for the remainder of this series. So, who did Jesus say he was? That is the question. How did Jesus refer to himself? To answer our question, was Jesus God? Let's look at that. Let's focus on that. Who did Jesus say he was, and how did Jesus refer to himself? First, let's get some contrast and ask, what is the most common way that the apostles, the disciples of Jesus, and the gospel writers refer to Jesus? What are the most common ways Jesus is referred to by others? The most common way Jesus is referred to by others in the four gospel accounts is the Christ. I'm sure you're all familiar. Jesus is referred to as Christ. And he's referred to as Christ around 200 times in the New Testament scriptures. 200 times. And real quick, I'd like to make one point and address a very common misunderstanding that I've noticed that many people have with the word Christ. First off, the word Christ, it's not a name. It's a title. We've went over this in previous videos, if you've watched with us, how God isn't a name. God is a title or a type of being. Yahweh is the name of God, our God. And God is a title. It's what he is, not who he is. Same with Christ. Christ is a title, not a name. It's not Jesus's last name, like many people seem to think. And a lot of people, I think, seem to think that without actually thinking about that, if that makes sense. But it's not Jesus's last name. It's not like Joseph Christ married Mary Christ, and Joseph and Mary Christ had a baby, and they named him Jesus Christ. That's not what happened. So, Christ, let's look at the word for a bit. You know, we like to look at the language of things here. Christ is an English word transliterated from the Greek word Christos. My Greek and Hebrew pronunciation is not the greatest, so bear with me on that. Christ is a English word transliterated from the Greek word Christos. Not translated, transliterated, which means we didn't invent a new word in English that means the same thing. We simply spelled a Greek word with English letters. That's the difference between a translation and a transliteration. And I find it very interesting the words they decide not to translate, but to transliterate. But that's a whole nother video, and it's someone else's video because it's something that falls way out of my area of expertise. But I find it very interesting. So, we have the English word Christ, transliterated from the Greek word Christos, which is translated from the Hebrew word Messiah, pronounced Mashiach. So, whether we say Mashiach, Messiah, Christos, Christ, they are all the same word, all the same title, that all have the same definition. Christ means the anointed one. To be anointed is to smear with oil. Someone who is poured, smeared, or rubbed oil on their head is anointed. That's what anointed means, to rub, smear, or pour oil on your head. Jesus is not the only anointed one. He's not the only anointed one in the Bible, not the only Christ. That might make people all itchy and uncomfortable right there. But it is a fact that Jesus is not the only Christ, not the only anointed one in the Bible. There are actually many Christs throughout the Bible. And there are only two types of people who are anointed. Priests get anointed and kings get anointed. Priests, kings. Those are the only two types of people anointed in the Bible. Usually they're anointed when they are initiating their priesthood or their kingship. So there are many called Christ throughout the Bible. When we use the title, the Christ, to refer to Jesus, Jesus Christ, we are giving Jesus the title of priest and king. That's what we're doing when we say Christ, when we call Jesus Christ. You're calling him our priest and king, Jesus. So Christ being the most common way Jesus is referred to by others, how did Jesus refer to himself? It wasn't the Christ. Jesus almost never used Christ to refer to himself. Christ is actually the way used by Jesus the least when referring to himself. It's used most by all others, the apostles, his disciples, the gospel authors, even by the church and even by the entire world today. Christ is by far the most common way to refer to Jesus Christ. but it is the way that he used the absolute least when referring to himself. So, how did Jesus refer to himself? What is the most common way Jesus referred to himself, rather? Because there are many ways that he referred to himself, but they're hit and miss, few and far between. Only once, a couple times, a handful of times here and there, different things that we're going to talk about in later episodes. But by far, the most common way that he referred to himself was as the Son of Man. That's very interesting already. Jesus uses the title, the Son of Man, over 100 times when talking about himself. Over 100 times he calls himself the Son of Man. Jesus does. If you've got a red letter Bible, in those red texts of the four Gospels, Jesus uses that title to talk about himself over 100 times. It's a lot. Making it by far the most used way for him to refer to himself. And he's also making it painfully obvious how he thought of himself and how he wanted others to think of him. There are many instances in the gospel accounts where others are talking about or directly talking to Jesus and refers to him as the Christ. And it's kind of funny in a way because they'll refer to Jesus as the Christ, talking about him or talking to him, and he will butt in, and instantly he changes what they said to the Son of Man. They'll call him the Christ, and he'll say, yes, me, the Son of Man. And it's kind of funny, but it's very important and very interesting and very telling because it happens several times. Like I said, that makes it obvious about what Jesus thought of himself, makes it obvious about who Jesus was saying that he was, who he thought he was, and also makes it painfully obvious how he wanted us, everyone else, to perceive him as. He did it several times. Why did Jesus call himself the Son of Man? What does that even mean? And why did he want us to think of him that way? Just like everything else to do with Jesus and the New Testament, it is hyperlinked back to the Hebrew Bible, to the Old Testament. Everything is. And this specifically, it's hyperlinked back to many places. Genesis, Ezekiel are a couple of the main ones. There are several more, but this title in particular, to this person in particular of Jesus, it has a hyperlink that is tied to a very short, very specific passage from the book of Daniel. And Daniel is a very interesting book. It's thought to be one of the very last scrolls written that was later incorporated into the Hebrew Bible, into the Old Testament, meaning that it's the newest or one of the newest additions to the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And it's definitely much later than the majority of the rest by at least a few hundred years. But as you know, dates are very up for debate. when it comes to any dating of the Bible, but at least a few hundred years newer than the majority of the rest, which is interesting. Daniel is actually a Adam or Christ-like figure in the story, and he's one who comes close. And reading the story of the Bible, or reading the story of Daniel, it seems like, this might be the Messiah. That's what people would be thinking. But then, of course, like all the others predating Jesus, he comes up short in some way. But nonetheless, a very interesting figure, a very interesting book that has a lot of great stories, very famous stories, like Daniel and his friends getting thrown into the lion den, and the lion's not eating them, getting thrown into the fire, and the fire not burning them. These are very famous stories, often, unfortunately, attributed to like children's stories, which is very unfortunate. There's also a lot of apocalyptic literature in Daniel. And as far as all the apocalyptic literature throughout the Bible, Daniel and the book of Revelation are usually the two greatest ones, the two that most people refer to, and the two actually tie in together perfectly. So, apocalyptic literature. And something else interesting about Daniel is that, for the most part, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, was all written in ancient Hebrew. In the New Testament, written in Greek. But there are a couple sections, only a couple of small sections in the Hebrew Bible, where the original scrolls weren't written in ancient Hebrew. They were written in its cousin language, Aramaic. And Daniel chapter 7, a specific chapter we're going to be looking at, where Jesus gets the title Son of Man, Daniel chapter 7 is one of the few sections of the Hebrew Bible that's written in Aramaic. So that's pretty interesting. But we are going to look into that passage that is hyperlinked from Jesus back to Daniel, and where Jesus gets the title, the Son of Man. We're going to discuss the title of Son of Man. We're going to discuss where it comes from and what that means. And we're going to further our discussion, getting one step further towards allowing the biblical authors and Jesus himself to answer our question: is Jesus God? On the next episode of the What the Hell podcast. Thank you for watching. Matter of fact, if you're watching right now, hit that subscribe button right down there. Right now, hit it. It's right down there. So you can stay up to date with everything going on here at What the Hell. And it does help us a lot. It does. So hit that little bell icon, subscribe, like, and share. Share a link with somebody. If one of you shares one link to one video to one person, who knows? Who knows what can happen? God has done a lot more with far less. What the Hell podcast. Is Jesus God? Part 2 coming up next.